Oh, that will piss people off. That will alienate them. It's this idea that whatever choice people make, politicians can't criticize that. Every choice you make has to be praised to the skies. Are we some kind of children? Or we become very childish?
I could agree with the diagnosis. Fringe has invaded the core. Things have fallen apart. The fabric has unraveled. We've lost the thread. Irreversible damage to the core, as you put it. And think, I live in a world where a kid can get instantaneous internet porn on their phone. You are never going to reweave that fabric. I don't say that with any degree of pleasure. Tyranny comes from the feudal, quixotic idea that we can somehow have a restoration. And that is, again, not endorsing the unraveling, simply coming to terms with it. The challenge is deeper than lament. It's a much more serious challenge than, oh, but. Because we're not going back to the 1950s as Kamala Harris. We're not going back. And again, don't ask me whether or not I wish we could go back, because the question is irrelevant.
Well, first of all, I actually disagree with you. All right. And I'm going to, once again, give you some concrete examples. Okay. Charles Murray says that the educated class in this country, the upper middle class, talks the 60s and lives the 50s. We have a whole group of people, even in the face of moral deregulation of the worst kind, right? This kind of laissez-faire, no holds barred, no more norms kind of society that we've inherited here, who reimpose on themselves these 50s type norms in many respects. Now, you're right that, I think it's just a kind of a straw man to say going back to the 50s, like we're going to go back to every aspect of the 50s. The 50s consisted of a lot of different parts and a lot of different elements. And some of them we're not going to go back to and we wouldn't want to go back to, right? Like the status of women, the rigid ways in which women and minorities were controlled.
Or of gays. Or of gays, I would say.
Or
and
gays.
I think the example is important. It's distinct from women and, much more directly at the sexual revolution. But I don't think we're going back on that. And I don't think we should go back on it.
Okay, but, the people are going to go crazy when I say this. But I think gayness is something that, was fringe and should on some level stay fringe and has now invaded the core. So, we're going to disagree.
Yeah, they're going to go ballistic.
They're going to go ballistic.
It
doesn't mean that we persecute gays like we did in the 50s. But let's go back to the ways in which a lot of the 50s is still with us in certain segments of society in a kind of self-imposed, remoralized way. So take porn, all right? Let's take porn. I have upper middle class students. They're from a very selected segment of society by and large, right? And I ask them, how much do you guys really, and I have mostly guys because I teach a big conservatism class. How much do you guys really watch porn? Do you spend all day watching porn? And if you don't, why don't you? Do you restrain yourself? I mean, you could sit like the rats and hit the, cocaine bar all day if you wanted to.
Yeah, you're right, Amy.
But you don't. And what you get, and it's very hard to get this out of them, right? Because they don't want to talk about it, is this intuition. It's not even expressed. It's not even, it doesn't even come to the surface that porn is degrading, not just to the person who's in it.
Sure, of course.
But to the person who watches it. I tell them, Lincoln said, I would not be a slave, but neither would I be a master. And I say, it's kind of the same concept. We actually read this wonderful essay by Irving Kristol about pornography, which is really wonderful. And I recommend it. It's masterful. I said, what do you think the parallel is between what Lincoln said and, what Irving Kristol is saying about why we should at least disapprove of pornography, make it harder to get, not stamp it out, as Lord Patrick Devlin would say, but keep it within bounds.
Well, here's an alternative. I mean, I do not disagree with what you just said. And in fact, I resonate with it. The self-degradation of porn addiction. You don't need addiction. And the self-governing, the self-regulation, there's self-degradation and there's self-regulation, which is an indirect acknowledgement of the degradation when someone says, no, I'm not going to spend all my time doing this. And I was going to say, you say we should at least disapprove of it. Okay. I want to bracket that question, although I'm inclined to agree with you. I think it requires further investigation. But I want to say it's not the only thing that we can do. We can also emphasize the self-governance part of it, the fact of degradation of self, which is what a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or person devoted to a spiritual commitment would be doing. As the spirit of self-governance could be enhanced, as well as the limitation that policy could place on access to the material.
Right. Self-governance to what the founders called virtue, right? Which they used to talk about all the time. And if you go back to the Federalist Papers, they say critical to the success of our way of life, our government, our institutions, our republic is self-mastery of the population, that they are willing to impose these limits to keep themselves within bounds. And I just don't see enough consciousness of that, enough talk about that, and enough talk about the sort of collective externalities of the failure of self-mastery. This, you're not going to you'll say, why is she bringing this up? But this is actually pertinent to a discussion I had with someone who will go nameless, because you'll recognize his name, about J.D. Vance's comment about cat ladies. So, which I thought was funny, but a lot of other people didn't. But anyway, this friend of mine, who's on the right, said he shouldn't have said that. He shouldn't have said that because it will alienate voters and it will insult people and yada, yada, yada. And I said, well, I don't know how many voters are going to be swayed by that one way or the other. But I said, it does represent a lost opportunity. J.D. Vance, who's a very smart guy, should be talking about the downsides both to individuals and to society of women turning against motherhood, of men and women turning against marriage, of, this kind of phase that we're going through that I see has accelerated. Certainly among my students, a lot of negative talk about having children, about motherhood. And what is that going to mean in the future? It's going to mean that a very significant chunk of women is going to be childless. Okay. Now, I think it's worth talking about how that is going to redound to their unhappiness in the long run. And there's a lot of short-term thinking, as you know. I sympathize with that because a lot of these people are struggling to make their way in the world and, to maintain their position in the upper middle class. And I get it, right? But it's also going to have negative consequences for society as a whole. And Glenn, you are, about as old as I am, and you are seeing your friends sort of sink into disability, and the ones who are childless and the ones who are unmarried, who's going to oversee them? Who's going to take care of them? That is going to be a society-wide crisis. These people are going to look to us to hold them harmless for their expressive individualist decisions, which nobody, challenges that it's theirs to make. See, if I were J.D. Vance, I would say in America, we do make our own decisions about how we're going to live our life, but that doesn't mean there aren't better or worse ways to live your life. I mean, it doesn't follow, and there aren't better or worse ways for society as a whole. So to not point out that crisis looming on the horizon, a crisis that cannot be solved, I don't care how many nice Filipino nurses you have, they cannot substitute for family, and they never will. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's saying that. And when I float this idea, this is what I get it from the right as well as the left. Oh, that will piss people off. That will alienate them. It's this idea that whatever choice people make, politicians can't criticize that. Every choice you make has to be praised to the skies. And, what are we, some kind of children? Are we become very childish as a society?
Well, you're making me wonder why Trump and Vance aren't saying the following. I want to make America great again. That's a cultural project. To make America great again, we have to become more virtuous. Here's how.
Absolutely. I mean, that would be wonderful. I mean, I'm not here to comment on Trump, but wouldn't it be nice to have leadership? We used to have it. We used to have that kind of leadership to say, you know what? There's no substitute for virtue. There's no substitute for self-mastery. There's no substitute for looking beyond your own immediate satisfaction and preferences to your future self, other people.
I think the answer to my question of why they don't do it is because if Trump were to say, let's make America virtuous again, Obama would, laugh him out of court. Trump,
right.
Make America virtuous? You got to be kidding me. On the other hand, the evangelicals who support Trump would be delighted and would be glad to lend a hand. And there is this larger argument, isn't there, within the national conservatism movement about the Burkean dimensions of, American,
absolutely,
socio-political cultural life, Josh Hawley, these people, but the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Atlantic, they're going to stand in the door. They're going to fight to the last person to prevent that from becoming
and they just label them fascists, and then we're done.